this study looks at enhancing adaptive performance in the fire service through empowerment at multiple leadership levels. And I did this research with Dr. Greer, who's at the University of Albany, and then both Drs. Murphy and Greco, who are professors at Oklahoma State. And I'm also finishing my PhD in the spring, so I'll actually be on the market this fall. So one thing to keep in mind is during emergency response conditions, as uncertainty and complexity increase, so does the need for responders to display heightened levels of adaptive performance. While fire departments are highly effective during routine or predictable response operations, which account for the majority of emergency calls, a lot of research suggests they struggle in being adaptable or flexible enough to handle large, expanding response events detailed by high levels of uncertainty and complexity. This is becoming even more problematic considering the complexity of disasters are increasing along with their number and severity due to changing conditions such as climate change, urbanization, et cetera. So some changes needed in order to make departments more adaptable. So part of the problem with the lack of adaptability in response organizations, or a major part of the problem, is due to the bureaucratic structure of these types of organizations. So they're extremely hierarchical and they possess formalized structures characterized by extensive rules, policies, and instructions, which can inhibit the flow of timely information and make it difficult to compensate for these changing circumstances, especially in these large, complex events. During the response to Hurricane Katrina, for example, firefighters and emergency services often had to bypass and even disregard bureaucratic policies and protocols in order to save lives. So you also have the idea that a lot of senior leaders in the fire service they tend to be risk averse, bureaucratic, and resistant to change, which can make firefighters during response events fear that if they make an error or try to improvise, it'll be met with repercussions for management. So the primary research question is how do we buffer these constraints of the hierarchy, specifically during these complex events, to increase adaptability and become more successful in these events? The theory used here is empowerment. So while sufficient empirical research is lacking, there's a lot of researchers that suggest demonstrating adaptive performance, especially in these conditions, depends on the extent to which responders are empowered to make important decisions. We're referring to this specifically as the ability to improvise during these events, to be able to use the use of resources and response tactics when warranted by the situation. It's not about freelancing, but it's about being able to improvise when the conditions dictate. So empowerment, the structural theories of empowerment are about removing employees' power constraints and motivating them to achieve organizational goals. So such as providing opportunities for growth and mobility and providing control over the conditions of their work. So you have perceptions of empowerment, or if employees feel empowered, then they're going to be more motivated and have the ability with their latitude to make decisions on the fly to be able to become more adaptable, right? But this empowerment or perceptions of empowerment among these firefighters is going to depend heavily on the behaviors of supervisors. So you can think of this as the antecedents of empowerment. So supervisor empowering behaviors, if you will. So supervisors or empowering supervisors are those who provide the necessary amount of coaching. So this helps employees feel they have the sufficient freedom, confidence, and control over their work assignments to make better autonomous decisions, right? Informing, so effective communication. So people have the knowledge to control their work, essentially. Supervisors who show concern, so employees feel supported and have less fear about making errors. Like I was talking about earlier, you don't want people to fear that if they do improvise or break an SOP, that they're going to get in trouble or it's going to be met with disciplinary actions. supervisors who display integrity, so leading by example, and said this sets a high standard for performance, and then also allowing for participative decision making, so employees have more discretion in the decision-making process, and therefore they have more authority and ability. It's about them being in control of the barriers to power and uncertainty. Another part of this model, which I'll show you a figure of soon, but we're also interested in the idea that, well, you have leaders at different levels, right? You have your mid-level supervisors, of course, and then you have your senior leaders, or your headquarters, if you will. And we're asking whether senior leaders also need to be empowering to achieve these effects, right? So this would be thought of as additive effects. Research usually only looks at one leadership level, but it doesn't really look at whether you need both reference or both levels of leadership to be these kind of effective, empowering leaders. What we're predicting is that when senior leaders are also empowered, these effects of supervisory empowering behaviors and consequent adaptive performance become much stronger. So you have interactive effects and moderated mediation going on here. So, for example, if supervisors let me improvise, but senior leadership doesn't like this to happen, I'll probably be hesitant to improvise or make decisions on my own, right? Because I'm afraid of that repercussion. So this is a visual of the model that we're testing. Specifically, the first hypothesis is the immediate supervisor empowering behaviors are going to directly predict personal empowerment. And then the second hypothesis explores also the direct relationship of whether personal empowerment leads to adaptive performance. Senior leader empowering behaviors is the moderator that tests for interactive effects up there in the upper left. And so the third hypothesis is just a moderation hypothesis between the focal variable and personal empowerment. And then the hypothesis 4 is for moderated mediation, which basically says that the indirect effects of personal empowerment or immediate supervisor empowering behaviors to adaptive performance through personal empowerment become much stronger when senior leaders are also very empowering themselves. To test our model, we developed a survey, and it was conducted in 2017. Our sample was one fire department, all operational members, so we didn't include administrative staff in the sample. So we have a reflective population of the firefighters, engineers, captains, battalion chiefs, et cetera. And we have 352 completed responses, or a 41% response rate overall. And then just briefly for the measures, we used previously validated measures for everything, but we also added some original items to really enhance the content validity of our constructs, because we needed to make sure. I'm so sorry, my dog is snoring and you hear her whining. Be quiet, sir. And so, we threw in a couple of extra original items to make sure that our measures were really reflective of these constructs in the fire service. And like I mentioned, and for adaptive performance, that is measured specifically in the context of complex events. Everything's measured on a 1 to 7 Likert scale, and all the scales showed really high reliability. The analysis method was, I used a macro called process developed by Preacher and Hayes. A lot of people use this for testing moderation, mediation, moderated mediation, serial mediation, all sorts of different models that include those types of tests. Specifically, the indirect effects were calculated with 5,000 bootstrap resamples, and to assess the significance of an effect, you look at the bias-corrected 95% confidence intervals, and essentially, if the confidence intervals do not contain a 0, then the effect is considered to be significant. And I'll get to that here in a minute. I'll mention it again. Getting to the results, so looking at the direct relationships. First, so you see in model 8 here that immediate supervisor empowering behaviors is predicting personal empowerment as the dependent variable. And as you can see, those effects are significant, and they're also significant for senior leader empowering behaviors. So those are significant and positive predictors of personal empowerment. But as you see, the interaction effects between the two are not significant. So this also negates the possibility of moderated mediation, and I'll get to the kind of the explanation of why we might see that. And then in model B, this is looking at adaptive performance as the outcome variable with personal empowerment directly predicting that. If you remember, that was hypothesis 2. And then while we didn't specifically hypothesize immediate supervisor empowering behaviors to predict adaptive performance, you see that's also a significant predictor as well. And then because moderated mediation was not a possibility, I went ahead and tested for simple mediation. So simply that personal empowerment explains the relationship between the supervisor empowering behaviors and adaptive performance. To make sure that we had indirect effects there. And as you can see here with the lower level and upper level, if it were not significant, you would see a negative sign here. And then therefore the intervals would cross 0, but you don't. So they're both positive, which means that the result is significant, showing that there is significant mediation occurring for both immediate supervisors and senior leaders. So for the, briefly, just for the results in the discussion, as I was just mentioning there, the direct relationships are significant, so supporting half our hypotheses, but this just shows as an empirical demonstration of how you can buffer these hierarchical constraints during complex events and become more adaptable, right? But with the moderation not significant, this indicates more of a compensatory effects. So meaning that if you have a senior leader, for example, who is risk averse, you can compensate if you have very strong empowering supervisors. So for another kind of theoretical explanation for this is that when you have a response scenario in the fire service, a incident commander is designated to lead it essentially. And these leaders are usually of mid-level or supervisory level ranks like captains. So these ranks, they generally hold most of the decision-making authority for which operational issues are handled anyways, meaning they could be the most influential alone in determining the extent to which they empower employees. The senior leaders are not often involved during these incidents in which the ICS is designated. These are just direct quotes. So at the end of the survey, we provided a box where essentially people could air out kind of their grievances, right, on some of these things. And so, for example, here's some quotes that some of the respondents wrote. So when an employee chooses to improvise during an event and makes a decision to go outside of an SOP, an immediate assumption of wrongdoing is assumed by senior leadership, and investigation talk is ensued. So this kind of supports the general idea of empowerment, right? And the it's just kind of showing you an illustration of sort of the problem of non-empowering leaders, right? So they're just talking about how leadership is hypocritical, incompetent at times, micromanaging, and kind of the effects of what not empowering employees can have on these organizations. So in conclusion, to bypass hierarchical constraints, become more adaptable, allowing firefighters to improvise is something we empirically demonstrated to achieve these effects. And so when you have a non-empowering senior leader, these results really show the importance for having very empowering supervisors to compensate, to sort of achieve these effects. And then lastly, for the limitations, because we didn't ask like what station firefighters worked in, we were not able to look at multi-level effects to see if there's any variance caused by the station, because you could have a leader in one station that is empowering and a leader in another that's not. You could look at the effects of this and how they relate to adaptive performance and empowerment. Only a single department was studied. And of course, there's other empowerment practices to consider. You can get into things like specific training practices and things of that nature to see the effects of that. And then, of course, there could also be other moderators that could explain the conditions when employees feel empowered It could also be that senior leaders, for example, it could be when they do specific things that they are more important in determining the significance of that relationship. And that's all I've got. Thank you, guys.